You know, sometimes people imagine that slavery was static, that people were just trapped in one place. Well, they were when they were on a particular farm or plantation, but in between, there was so much movement. We have a remarkable letter, the only one that I've seen, of a person caught in the middle of this slave trade. Maria Perkins. She writes it from Charlottesville, Virginia in the 1850s, and she sends it to her husband, Richard, saying that she and their child were up for sale, and that another child of theirs, named Albert, had already been sold to a trader. And this letter gives us remarkable insight into an alarmingly, distressingly common scene in the antebellum South. The slave trade moved at widely varying velocities. It was at its peak in the 1830s and again in the 1850s. The slave trade accelerated when the price for cotton in particular was high, and people who owned slaves, who owned land, who ran plantations would go into debt to buy more enslaved people, thinking that this would be their chance to make a lot of money. So the great paradox, or the tragedy, is the more the South prospered, the more the enslaved people of the South suffered. So this letter from Maria Perkins to her husband, telling about the selling of their son Albert. More often than not, the people bought and sold were teenagers. And as soon as they were capable of performing heavy labor, or as soon as they were capable of bearing children, it's when they were at the greatest risk of being sold. So Albert could have found himself taken to the booming cotton plantations of Mississippi or Arkansas or Texas, or if he was particularly unfortunate, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. I say particularly unfortunate because the mortality rate on those sugar plantations was so extraordinarily high. Now, Maria says that she and the other child are for sale too. This is not uncommon. What you would find is that smaller planters, people who claim to own just one or two people, would often buy women, partly because women were useful in the house as well as in the field, but also because women could allow the property investment to grow. If a young woman had a young child, chances are that she could have another young child, and that would be an even better investment. So what we're seeing is the families are being pulled apart by gender, that young men like Albert are being sent to Louisiana, where as many as 90% of the people they bought were males, whereas the majority of the farms and plantations in the South that were smaller were more likely to buy women. So not only did you have the slave trade separating old from young, children from parents, but you also found the slave trade separating men from women, husbands from wives. The other thing the letter tells us, in a heartbreaking way, is that even though they have no control over their futures, she ends the letter by saying, "I am and will always be your kind wife, Maria." And that's the only moment that they appear in history. We don't know what happens to any of them. But what we do know is what happened to them happened to 1 million people. There's 1 million people moved from the eastern South to the western South over the antebellum period. If you add up all of the sales sort of locally, it's 2 million. And what this means is if you're a man or a woman, you face different kinds of odds. If you're young or you're old, you face different kinds of odds. If you live in one kind of plantation district growing tobacco or wheat, you're in a different one than one that grows cotton and sugar. So slavery is not a static institution. Sometimes people imagine that slavery was simple, but it was really complicated and very mobile. As a matter of fact, the mobility of enslaved people is one of the defining facts of American slavery. Constantly shifting to the west, constantly shifting to the plantation districts, but also swirling around wherever people happen to be. Slavery had one commonality, no matter where it was and what people grew. On any day, your family could be taken apart. On any day, your children could be sold away from you. On any day, you could find your mother or your father gone.